Steve, before you move to the second one,
Yeah.
you mentioned Great Commission and the five Great Commissions. Marvin Newell, another book I'd recommend, A Third of Us. He goes through the five different Great Commission passages, and one of the things I mentioned this earlier. I listened to a Missio Nexus podcast with Marvin Newell, and someone asked if Isaiah 117 was the new Great Commission.
In what sense?
And this is learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. And I would agree these things are important, but it concerned me that in 2022, and this is not just an average, this is Missio Nexus, someone's asking if this is replacing the Great Commission. So I see the need for a book like yours. If we shift away from this, Great Commission of discipleship and evangelism to becoming, social concern, which that is important to the heart of God. But could you comment on that in terms of your trend, what you're seeing in terms of people's knowledge? You talked about the Barna Report,
Right.
And go ahead. Sorry.
No, yeah. And that actually relates to one of the other myths that I unpack in one of the other chapters, and that is the sense that missions is everything. And all good outreach related activities qualify as missions. And they're obviously a part of the overall mission that God has called us to. But when we talk about missions in the sense of seeing Jesus known and glorified among all the cultures of the world, that's a very special and comprehensive and intentionality requiring calling that God has given to all of us as believers. And there's this term genericizing, like in Indonesia. People use the term Honda for any kind of motorcycle. So people
we call
ask
them
you,
Chondas around here, the knockoff Hondas.
Yeah, so you'll hear a conversation like this. Hey, do you have a Honda? Yeah, it's a Suzuki or a Yamaha or a Kawasaki. And our intent is not to create tiers and second-class categories of activity, but the cross-cultural communication of the gospel to the ethne of the world is a special task that requires intentionality and requires specific vocabulary if we're going to be able to talk about it and pursue it actively and consciously and with intelligence. So you're right. And I think in our culture and around the world, there's a trend, it's actually a dangerous trend to replace gospel proclamation and discipleship with a lot of other good activities. And ironically, the more concerned we are about the social ills of the world around us, the more critical it is that the gospel is proclaimed and understood and that disciples are made. That's the foundation for change. Would you agree?
Yes. Absolutely. And that's it makes me think of another book from one of the pioneers, When Everything is Missions, when the Denny Spitters and Matthew Ellison, when everything is missions, nothing is missions. And
yes.
and it's well intentioned, of not, like you said, not trying to pedestal people or not make anyone feel left out. But I like John Piper, this idea that the wartime life, we all contribute to the war effort. We all make sacrifices, but we're not all, we don't say that we're all, on the front line fighting. We're all contributing to that effort. And so I'm excited to see what you have in this book, just because, the trends that, one of the things they talk about when everything is missions is, when you focus on a social ill in society and that's all you go after, and you don't go after the ultimate problem of sin and the underlying, then you don't get either one. You don't.
Right.
And it talks about when in places where you see gospel proclamation and church planting, that's when you see the transformation of society. And so I think it's good for us to reiterate these things of, of sin and the gospel. Jesus came to redeem and make all things new, and so that has to happen if we want to see true societal change.
So, John, an example of that is a sociologist named Robert Woodbury did a PhD study on the impact of Protestant missions in West Africa. And he came away with the surprising conclusion that if you wanted a thriving democracy with thriving social institutions, get in a time machine, go back into the 1800s and send Protestant missionaries to these countries. It was just fascinating. And I experienced that growing up, among the Sawi. And it was the breakthrough of the gospel message that actually ended up preserving their culture and preserving their language, because so many languages are disappearing. But if they have the Bible in their language, if they're having church services in their own language, and when we went back 50 years later, my father and my brothers and I, it's recorded in this video, Never the Same, on YouTube. We found that the Sawi still, and I could still understand it. I had a hard time speaking Sawi. I mostly used Indonesian because I understood Indonesian more. But anyway, they loved their language. And decades later, it was still being preserved and their culture was being preserved. Why? Because sympathetic outsiders arrived, learned their language and culture, and incarnated the love of God, within their society. So it's fantastic. I think so many people need to hear that positive message.